December 19, 1944, somewhere inside the frozen Ardennes, a German officer bent over a map and saw something his superiors did not want to see. The American line was collapsing. German tanks were moving west. Roads were filled with retreating soldiers, abandoned equipment, burning vehicles, and columns trying to escape before the next panzer formation appeared through the fog.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
Adolf Hitler's great winter offensive seemed to be working, but General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the German Fifth Panzer Army, understood that something was wrong. The Americans were losing ground, but they were not finished. And somewhere far to the south was one American commander Manteuffel could not afford to ignore. George S. Patton. Manteuffel understood what Patton's enemies had learned the hard way. Patton did not like waiting for a battlefield to become clear. He moved while everyone else was still trying to understand what had happened. If the Germans believed the American Third Army would simply remain facing east while Bastogne was surrounded to the north, they were making a dangerous assumption. Patton could turn. He could come north. And if he did it fast enough, the entire German offensive could begin falling apart from the side. The frightening part was that the Germans had evidence pointing toward exactly that danger. The tragedy was that their command system had already committed itself to another dream. Only 3 days earlier, before dawn on December 16, the Ardennes had exploded. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, German artillery opened fire along a broad section of the American front. Soldiers who had considered the Ardennes a relatively quiet sector suddenly heard shells crashing through trees and positions around them. Searchlights reflected off low clouds. Infantry began moving through the darkness. Tanks followed behind. The offensive was enormous. Hitler's objective was Antwerp. His plan was to punch through the American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split the British and American armies. On paper, the operation promised something Germany desperately needed: a decisive victory. In reality, Germany was gambling fuel, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and thousands of experienced soldiers it could barely replace. The gamble depended on speed. That meant the Americans could not be allowed time to recover. At first, they almost did not get it. German units broke through several American positions. Confusion spread behind the front. Reports contradicted one another. Nobody immediately understood the size of the attack. Then, the roads became nightmares. You can almost feel the freezing wind cutting across the Ardennes as engines struggle in the darkness. Snow and mud cover narrow roads. Military police wave vehicles through intersections already clogged with trucks. Exhaust hangs in the cold air. Somewhere beyond the trees comes the dull sound of artillery. And through all of it, commanders are trying to answer one question: where are the Germans going? By December 18, the answer was becoming terrifyingly clear: west, fast. But there was another question. What would the Americans do next? That was where men like Manteuffel became important. He was not simply commanding tanks from a distant headquarters. He had spent years fighting mobile warfare. He understood that breakthroughs created opportunities, but they also created exposed flanks. Every kilometer German armor advanced westward stretched supply lines farther. Every road junction became more important. Every gallon of gasoline mattered. And the farther German spearheads moved, the more dangerous an American attack from the south could become. One place sat directly in the middle of this problem. Bastogne, the Belgian town, was not valuable because of factories or size. It mattered because of roads. Several important routes passed through and around Bastogne. Control that junction, and German forces could move men, ammunition, fuel, and armor more efficiently toward the west. Lose it, and everything became harder. The Americans understood this quickly. Elements of the 101st Airborne Division were rushed toward Bastogne under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, while armored and infantry units fought desperately around the approaches. German troops began closing around the town. By December 20, Bastogne was effectively surrounded. From the German perspective, this should have been another step toward victory, but every hour spent fighting there was also an hour lost. Every tank diverted toward Bastogne was a tank not racing toward the Meuse. And every hour the defenders survived gave another American commander time to move. Patton, at that moment, Patton's Third Army was fighting far to the south, primarily facing east toward Germany. Turning it north sounded simple on a map. It was anything but simple. An army is not a single object. It is tens of thousands of men. Tanks, trucks, artillery, engineers, medical units, fuel columns, ammunition vehicles, maintenance crews, kitchens, radios, headquarters, military police. Changing direction meant changing everything behind them. Road priorities had to be rewritten. Supply dumps had to move. Traffic routes had to change. Units already engaged with the enemy had to disengage. New attack plans had to reach commanders across an enormous area. Under winter conditions, such a maneuver should have required precious time. But Patton had already started thinking about it. That is the detail that would soon become crucial. On December 18, before the Allied High Command had fully decided how to respond, Patton instructed his staff to begin preparing options for a movement north. He was not waiting for permission to start thinking. His staff began studying routes. 3 possible counterattack plans were prepared. That meant when Patton walked into one of the most important Allied meetings of the Battle of the Bulge, he carried something other commanders did not expect. He already had an answer. December 19. Verdun, France, General Dwight D. Eisenhower gathered senior American commanders to decide how to stop the German breakthrough. The situation was still dangerous. The Germans had achieved surprise. Bastogne was threatened. Allied units were scattered across a huge front. Eisenhower needed pressure against the southern side of the German penetration. Then came the question that would later become famous. How quickly could Patton attack north? Patton's answer stunned the room. He could attack with 3 divisions on December 22. Some officers reportedly reacted with disbelief. It sounded too fast. Patton was talking about turning major elements of Third Army approximately 90 degrees and launching an offensive within days. But this was not an impulsive promise. His staff had already been working. The preparations had begun before the meeting. That difference mattered. While Allied commanders were deciding what should happen, Patton had already begun preparing for what he believed would happen. And across the German lines, the danger of such a move was becoming increasingly obvious. Manteuffel's Fifth Panzer Army was driving through the center of the German offensive, but its southern shoulder could never be ignored. A successful American thrust from Luxembourg toward Bastogne could strike directly into that vulnerable area. German commanders faced a brutal contradiction. To keep advancing west, they needed to concentrate strength forward. To protect themselves against Patton, they needed strength on the flank. They could not do both forever. Fuel was already becoming a serious problem. Traffic jams slowed movement. American resistance was stiffening. Important road junctions were refusing to fall quickly enough, and Allied reinforcements were arriving. The offensive was still moving, but its clock was running faster than anyone wanted to admit. At the highest level, Hitler remained focused on the original objective: Antwerp, the Meuse, the grand breakthrough. The operation had been built around the belief that the Western Allies could be divided and thrown into crisis. Changing the objective now would mean admitting that the original plan was slipping away. That was politically and militarily difficult inside the German command structure. So German armored formations continued pushing west. And Bastogne continued holding. Inside the surrounded town, conditions deteriorated. The cold became relentless. Supplies were limited. Casualties increased. Medical facilities struggled. Fog and low clouds restricted Allied air support. German artillery continued pounding American positions. The defenders did not know exactly when relief would arrive. They only knew they had to keep the roads closed to the Germans. Outside the pocket, Patton's army was beginning one of the most remarkable operational changes of direction of the campaign. Thousands of vehicles started moving. Divisions shifted north. Traffic control became critical. Soldiers who had expected to continue east suddenly found themselves traveling toward Luxembourg. The weather made everything worse. Roads were slippery. Visibility was poor. Men were exhausted. Machines broke down. But the columns kept moving. The German command now faced the nightmare Manteuffel, and other experienced commanders understood from the map. The Americans were not merely recovering. They were concentrating against the flank. And there was another problem. Patton was moving faster than the Germans needed him to move. On December 24th, the day before Patton planned to attack, German forces delivered a surrender demand to Bastogne. McAuliffe rejected it. The Americans remained surrounded. From the outside, Bastogne appeared to be trapped. From the German perspective, there was still time to crush the pocket. But look south. That is where the real story was moving. Patton's lead formations were assembling. Among them was Major General Hugh Gaffey's 4th Armored Division. Its tanks and armored infantry were about to drive toward Bastogne. The weather remained miserable. German resistance waited ahead. Nobody could guarantee success. But the attack was coming. The Germans had correctly identified the possibility. Experienced officers understood the danger. Yet the German war machine remained tied to a plan demanding movement west when the threat that could break the operation was building from the south. And on the morning of December 22, 1944, the question was no longer whether George Patton would turn north. He already had. Now there was only one question left. Could the Germans stop him before he reached Bastogne? Before sunrise on December 22, 1944, engines came to life across southern Luxembourg. The frozen air carried the deep rumble of Sherman tanks, tank destroyers, artillery tractors, and endless columns of trucks. Soldiers pulled their collars higher against the bitter cold as headlights cut through the darkness. Orders moved quietly from vehicle to vehicle. The great turn of Patton's Third Army was complete. Now it was time to find out if speed could defeat surprise. The first attacks met determined German resistance almost immediately. The roads leading toward Bastogne were narrow, icy, and heavily defended. German infantry occupied villages that had become strongpoints. Anti-tank guns were hidden behind stone buildings and tree lines. Every crossroads had the potential to become a deadly trap. Progress was measured in miles, sometimes only in hundreds of yards. Yet unlike the confused American units caught off guard on December 16, these formations knew exactly where they were going. From his headquarters, Hasso von Manteuffel watched the situation with growing concern. His armored army was still driving west, but reports from the southern flank became harder to ignore. American pressure was increasing. Fresh units were appearing where German intelligence had expected only scattered resistance. The pattern was becoming clear. Patton was doing exactly what Manteuffel had feared. This was not luck. It was operational thinking. Manteuffel had spent years studying fast-moving warfare. He understood that Patton preferred aggressive action over hesitation. If the Germans created a large bulge in the Allied line, Patton would almost certainly attack the side of it instead of waiting behind defensive positions. It was the fastest way to threaten German supply routes and force the offensive to slow down. But understanding the danger and convincing higher command were two different things. The German High Command remained committed to the larger objective. Hitler still believed the offensive could reach the Meuse River if enough pressure was maintained. Every available armored formation was expected to continue pushing west. Diverting major forces to block Patton meant weakening the main effort. To many senior leaders, that risk seemed unacceptable. The result was exactly what Manteuffel had feared. German commanders on the ground had to defend an increasingly exposed flank with limited resources while still trying to maintain momentum toward the west. At the same time, another enemy was attacking the German army. Fuel, every advancing tank burned precious gasoline that Germany could barely replace. Long vehicle columns stretched across frozen roads. Traffic jams delayed supplies. Broken bridges forced long detours. Recovery vehicles struggled to pull damaged tanks from muddy ditches. Even successful attacks consumed resources the Germans could no longer afford to waste. The farther they advanced, the more difficult the situation became. Patton understood this weakness better than most Allied commanders. Destroying German tanks was important, but cutting their movement was often even more valuable. A stalled panzer division without fuel could become almost useless regardless of how many tanks remained operational. As the days passed, American pressure continued to build. On December 23, the weather finally began to change. For nearly a week, heavy clouds and fog had protected German forces from Allied air power. Then the skies cleared. Almost immediately, hundreds of Allied aircraft filled the air over the battlefield. Fighter bombers hunted German vehicles on roads. Transport aircraft dropped desperately needed supplies into Bastogne. The defenders inside the surrounded town watched parachutes drifting through the cold winter sky. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, and equipment began reaching exhausted American soldiers. For the Germans, the change was devastating. Vehicles that had moved safely under cloud cover now faced constant attack from the air. Bridges, road junctions, and fuel convoys became dangerous places to gather. Movement slowed even further. Inside Bastogne, the defenders still faced relentless pressure. German artillery continued firing into the town. Infantry attacks probed the American perimeter. Casualties mounted every day. Medical personnel worked with limited supplies while treating wounded soldiers inside cold buildings that offered little protection from the winter weather. The men defending Bastogne did not know exactly how close Patton's forces were. They only knew they had to hold one more day. Then another. Then another. South of the town, the 4th Armored Division fought forward village by village. Major General Hugh Gaffey pushed his commanders to maintain momentum despite difficult conditions. One of the key combat commands was led by Colonel Creighton Abrams, an aggressive armored officer whose leadership would later become legendary. Abrams understood that time mattered as much as firepower. Every hour Bastogne remained isolated increased the danger for its defenders. German resistance remained fierce. Tanks exchanged fire across snow-covered fields. Infantry cleared buildings room by room. Engineers repaired damaged roads while artillery fired almost continuously in support of advancing troops. The battlefield became a contest of endurance. Meanwhile, Manteuffel continued fighting a campaign that was becoming harder to sustain. His earlier concerns were now unfolding in real time. The German offensive had not collapsed overnight, but it was steadily losing the speed that had made it dangerous during the first days. The exposed flank demanded attention. Fuel shortages demanded attention. American air power demanded attention. Bastogne demanded attention. Every new problem pulled strength away from the original objective. By December 24, Christmas Eve, German commanders knew they were facing a very different battlefield than the one they had entered 8 days earlier. The offensive was no longer racing forward. Instead, it was fighting to maintain momentum while responding to growing Allied counterattacks. The following day brought another bitter Christmas under fire. For thousands of soldiers on both sides, there were no celebrations. There were only frozen foxholes, damaged vehicles, artillery shells, and uncertainty. Snow covered abandoned equipment and the bodies of men who would never return home. The Battle of the Bulge had become one of the harshest winter battles fought by American forces during the Second World War. Then came December 26. Shortly before evening, elements of the 4th Armored Division finally reached the southern edge of Bastogne. The link-up was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. The town remained under fire. German forces still surrounded much of the area. The fighting was far from over. But the siege had been broken. A narrow corridor now connected Bastogne with the rest of the American lines. For the exhausted defenders inside the town, it was proof that they had not been forgotten. For Patton, it confirmed that his rapid turn north had succeeded. For Manteuffel, it confirmed the prediction he had understood days earlier. Patton had attacked exactly where experienced German officers believed he would. History often remembers victories and defeats. It remembers famous generals and dramatic speeches. What it sometimes forgets are the accurate warnings that disappear inside headquarters before anyone acts on them. There is no evidence that German commanders were completely blind to Patton's threat. On the contrary, experienced officers like Manteuffel clearly appreciated the danger posed by a fast American counterattack from the south. The problem was not a lack of military understanding. It was the inability to change a plan once it had already begun. Large military organizations often struggle with this problem. Plans are built over months. Resources are assigned. Expectations grow. Once thousands of vehicles and hundreds of thousands of soldiers are moving, changing direction becomes extraordinarily difficult. Hitler believed the offensive still had a chance to achieve its original objectives. Many commanders continued trying to fulfill that vision despite changing conditions on the battlefield. Reality, however, does not negotiate. Every passing day strengthened the Allies. Every passing day weakened Germany. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was ending. The Germans had failed to reach Antwerp. They had failed to split the Allied armies. They had lost irreplaceable tanks, vehicles, aircraft, fuel, and experienced soldiers. The offensive that had begun with surprise and momentum ended by exhausting many of Germany's remaining reserves. Patton's Third Army played a major role in that outcome. Its rapid pivot north remains one of the most impressive operational maneuvers of the European campaign. The ability to redirect an entire field army during winter conditions, coordinate multiple corps, maintain supply lines, and launch an effective counterattack within days demonstrated why Patton was considered one of the Allies' most aggressive commanders. Yet there is another lesson hidden beneath the larger story. Wars are not always lost because commanders fail to predict their enemy. Sometimes they lose because the correct prediction arrives in the wrong room. Somewhere inside a German headquarters during those freezing days of December 1944, experienced officers looked at maps, measured distances, studied roads, and reached the right conclusion. They understood Patton's habits. They understood his speed. They understood that the southern flank represented the greatest danger to the offensive. They were right. But being right is not enough if no one is willing to act. As winter slowly tightened its grip over the Ardennes, the battlefield became silent once again. Burned tanks rested beside frozen roads. Broken artillery pieces disappeared beneath fresh snow. Empty helmets and abandoned equipment marked places where fierce battles had been fought only days earlier. The maps that had once promised victory became historical documents. The warnings that had once seemed inconvenient became undeniable facts. And among the countless stories of the Battle of the Bulge, one remains especially haunting. A German officer looked at the battlefield before history unfolded. He correctly saw Patton's next move. He understood exactly where the greatest danger would come from. But his prediction could not change the course of events. Because sometimes the most dangerous mistake in war is not failing to see the future. It is refusing to believe the man who already has.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.